Welcome to our channel. Today's story follows a young enslaved boy who escaped to the mountains of Bourbon Island and against all odds became the most feared gunman in the Indian Ocean. His past was erased, his name buried, but his story survived. It is a brutal and intense journey through violence, survival, and transformation. Take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments from which city and country you are listening. Your participation helps us ensure these stories are remembered, not erased. Let's begin. In the summer of 1873, a man dressed entirely in black entered a tavern in Saint-Paul-de-Bourbon. He was tall, with broad shoulders. His skin was as black as midnight. His eyes held something that made grown men look away. In less than 60 seconds, he drew his revolver and fired a bullet through the skull of a man named Bertrand Boucher. Before anyone could react, the stranger vanished into the scorching afternoon sun. That single gunshot would echo across Bourbon Island for the next 2 years. It was the first shot in a campaign of vengeance that would leave 18 men dead. It was the announcement that a ghost had returned to collect debts that white men had long thought forgotten. The gunman's name was Zacharie Noir, born enslaved. Escaped at 13, trained by a legendary French marksman, hunting every man he had ever made bleed. Newspapers called him a monster. Wanted posters called him dangerous. Enslaved people who still remembered him called him something else. They called him vengeance. To understand how Zacharie Noir became the most feared man on Bourbon Island, we must go back to the beginning, not to his birth, but to his mother's death. For that is where his true story begins. It is the moment the boy named Zacharie died, and something else took his place. The year was 1858. The location was a large sugar plantation called Domaine des Bassins, located about 40 kilometers west of Saint-Denis-de-Bourbon. The owner was a man named Marquis Claude des Bassins. He was not actually a marquis in the military sense. He had never served in the army. But in the French colonies before abolition, wealthy plantation owners often gave themselves aristocratic titles to appear more important. Marquis des Bassins owned 3,000 arpents of land and 112 enslaved human beings. He was considered one of the most prosperous planters in the region. His sugar sold at premium prices in Bordeaux and La Rochelle. His name appeared in newspapers as an example of colonial prosperity. What the newspapers did not mention was how that prosperity was built. It did not mention the floggings. It did not mention the brands inflicted. It did not mention families torn apart and sold like cattle. It did not mention the bodies buried in unmarked graves behind the slave quarters. Marquis Claude des Bassins was a monster, but in Bourbon, monsters like him were called gentlemen. Zacharie was born on the des Bassins plantation in 1847. His mother's name was Josephine. She worked in the main house as a domestic servant, preparing meals, cleaning floors, and doing everything the white family demanded. Josephine was known for two things among the other enslaved people: her kindness and her voice. She sang hymns while she worked. Old spirituals her grandmother had taught her, songs about Moses and freedom and a promised land beyond the river. The other enslaved people said her voice could make you cry, even if you didn't understand the words. Zacharie grew up listening to that voice. It was the only beautiful thing in a world of ugliness. Josephine secretly gave her son his name in the darkness of the slave cabin where he lived with 6 other families, Zacharie. It came from the Bible. It meant God remembers. She whispered it to him every night before sleep. "Your name means God remembers," she would say. "He remembers every wound, every tear, every wrong done to his children, and one day he will make it right. Remember that, my baby. No matter what they do to you, God remembers." Zacharie's father was sold to another plantation on Réunion when Zacharie was 3 years old. He had no memory of the man, only the stories his mother told him. His father had been strong, a field hand who could cut 300 pounds of sugar cane in a single day. He had been sold because Marquis de Bassins needed money to buy more land. That's how it worked. Human beings were converted into acreage. Fathers were turned into cash. Zacharie never saw his father again. He never learned if the man had lived or died. That was slavery. You could lose everything you loved overnight, and no one would even tell you where it had gone. By the age of 5, Zacharie was already working, though not in the fields yet. He was too small for that. But there was plenty of work for small children on a plantation. He carried water to the field workers. He collected eggs from the chicken coops. He swept the paths around the main house. He ran errands for the White family, fetching things and delivering messages. The de Bassins' children, 2 boys and a girl about his age, sometimes threw stones at him for amusement. If Zacharie cried, he was whipped. If he ran, he was whipped harder. He very quickly learned not to cry. He learned to make his face a mask that showed nothing. It was his first lesson in survival. The chief overseer of the de Bassins plantation was a man named Bertrand Boucher. He was not a rich man himself. He came from poor white stock, what plantation owners called trash whites behind their backs. But Boucher had found his place in the world. He had discovered that he liked hurting people, that he was good at it. Marquis de Bassins paid him well to maintain discipline among the enslaved people, and Bertrand Boucher earned every franc. He carried a whip made of braided leather with small metal weights woven into the ends. When it struck flesh, it wasn't simply bruises, it tore. It left scars that never fully healed. Boucher used that whip almost every day. He said it was necessary to maintain order, but anyone watching him work could see the truth. He enjoyed it. He smiled when he struck. He laughed when they screamed. Zacharie was 7 years old the day his mother died. It was a Tuesday in August. The heat was brutal, over 40 degrees Celsius, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer like water. Josephine was working in the main house, preparing dinner for the de Bassins family. She was carrying a large ceramic pitcher of milk from the kitchen to the dining room. The pitcher was heavy, her hands slippery with sweat. It slipped. It fell. It shattered on the hardwood floor, milk spreading across the polished wood. Madame de Bassins, the Marquis's wife, was in the room when it happened. She screamed, not because she was hurt. The pitcher hadn't come near her. She screamed because an enslaved person had broken something that belonged to her, because a black woman had made a mess in her beautiful dining room, because it was hot and she was irritable and needed someone to punish. She called Bertrand Boucher. What happened next was something Zacharie would remember for the rest of his life. Every detail, every sound, every image burned into his brain with a permanent fire. He was outside the house, sweeping the front path, when he heard his mother scream. He ran. He wasn't supposed to run. Enslaved people weren't supposed to run near the main house, but he heard his mother's voice, and his legs moved before his brain could stop them. He came around the corner of the house and saw them in the courtyard behind the kitchen. Bertrand Boucher had his mother tied to a wooden post. Her dress had been torn from her back. Boucher stood behind her with his whip. Madame de Bassins watched from the shade of a mango tree, fanning herself lightly with a faint smile on her face. Marquis de Bassins stood beside his wife, arms crossed, looking bored. This was routine for them. It was entertainment. Boucher raised the whip and brought it down. The sound it made when it struck flesh was something between a crack and a wet slap. Josephine screamed. Blood appeared on her back, bright red against her dark skin. Boucher raised the whip again and again and again. Zacharie tried to run to his mother. One of the other overseers grabbed him and held him in place. "Look, boy," the man said, "look at what happens when you forget your place." He watched. He had no choice. He watched Bertrand Boucher whip his mother 37 times. He counted every strike. He watched her screams turn into whimpers, then into silence. He watched her body become still against the post. He watched Boucher finally stop from exertion, wiping sweat from his forehead. He watched Marquis de Bassins nod in approval and turn back to the house with his wife as if nothing important had happened. They left Josephine tied to the post. She was barely breathing. The other enslaved people were not allowed to help her until nightfall. By then, it was too late. She had lost too much blood. The wounds had already begun to infect in the humid heat. She developed a fever that night. By dawn, she was dead. Zacharie was not allowed to attend her burial. He was not allowed to say goodbye. He was sent to the field that very morning. Marquis de Bassins had decided that at 7 years old, he was old enough to start working in the sugarcane fields. There was no time for mourning. There was no space for grief. There was only work. But something had changed inside Zacharie. Something had broken. Or perhaps something had been born. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't try to run away. He went to the field and worked the sugarcane with hands that were too small for the job. He returned to the cabin that night and lay down in the spot where his mother used to sleep. And he made a promise, not to God, not to anyone who might be listening, but to himself. He promised that one day he would find Bertrand Boucher, he would find Marquis de Bassins, he would find everyone who had watched while his mother died, and he would make them pay, every one of them. The next 2 years were the hardest of Zacharie's life. He worked in the fields from sunrise to sunset. The sugarcane stalks tore at his small fingers until they bled. Bourbon's sun burned his skin. The overseers whipped every enslaved person who didn't meet their daily quota. Zacharie rarely met his quota. He was too young, too small, too new to the work. He was whipped at least once a week, sometimes more. The scars on his back began to overlap, creating a map of pain that covered him from shoulder to waist. But he didn't break. That's what the overseers noticed. That's what made them uncomfortable. Most enslaved people, when repeatedly whipped, developed a certain look in their eyes. A dullness, a defeat. Their spirit left them. They became docile, compliant, easier to manage. That was the purpose of the floggings, not just to punish, but to destroy the will to resist. Zacharie never had that look. His eyes remained sharp, focused, alert. When the overseers looked into his eyes, they saw something that bothered them. They saw hatred, not the hot, explosive hatred that made a man do something stupid and get himself killed. It was cold, patient, controlled. Bertrand Boucher noticed it once and told another overseer. "That one has the devil in him," Boucher said. "We're going to have to sell him before he's grown. He's the type who kills masters in their sleep." In 1859, when Zacharie was 9 years old, Marquis de Bassan did something that etched itself into Zacharie for the rest of his life. He sold Zacharie's younger sister. Her name was Marguerite. She was 6 years old. Zacharie had taken care of her since their mother died. He made sure she ate. He protected her from older children who might harm her. He told her stories at night, the same stories their mother used to tell about Moses and freedom and a promised land beyond the river. Marguerite was the only family Zacharie had left. She was the only person in the world he loved. One morning, a man arrived at the plantation in an elegant carriage. His name was Laurent Marchand, and he was a slave trader from Fort-de-France in Martinique. He had come to inspect Marquis de Bassan's enslaved people and make purchases. This happened regularly on the plantation. Slave traders passed through like traveling salesmen looking for bargains, separating families with a stroke of a pen. Marchand walked through the slave quarters with Marquis de Bassan, examining the human merchandise. He squeezed muscles, he checked teeth, he asked for information about health and temperament. When he saw Marguerite, he stopped. "That one?" he said, pointing. "How much for the girl?" Zacharie watched from 6 meters away. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. Enslaved people had no right to object when their family members were sold. They had no right to do anything at all. They stood there paralyzed while Marquis de Bassan and Laurent Marchand negotiated the price of his sister. They agreed on 400 francs. Marguerite was taken that same day. She cried for Zacharie when they put her in the wagon. She reached her small hands out to him. Zach, don't let them take me." He ran towards the wagon. An overseer struck him on the head with the butt of a rifle. When he woke up, Marguerite was gone. He never saw her again. He never knew where she had been taken. He added 2 more names to his list that day. Marquis de Bassan, Laurent Marchand. One day they would pay. The only thing that kept Zacharie alive during those years was Michel. Michel was an enslaved boy about Zacharie's age, perhaps a year older. They had known each other since they were small. But after Zacharie's mother died and his sister was sold, Michel became something more. He became Zacharie's only friend, his only connection to something like hope. Michel was different from Zacharie. Where Zacharie was silent and watchful, Michel was talkative and quick to smile. Where Zacharie kept his hatred buried deep, Michel seemed to have made peace with their situation. "We can't change what they do to us," Michel said one night as he lay in the cabin waiting for sleep. "We can only control what's inside us. I won't let them make me hate. That's giving them too much power." Zacharie disagreed. Hatred was the only thing that sustained him, but he loved Michel anyway. Michel was the only person who could make him laugh, the only person who reminded him that there was still good in the world, even in a place as terrible as this. They made plans together, whispered plans in the dark. One day he would escape. He would run to the highlands of the island, to the mountains where it was said a black man could completely disappear. He would find Zacharie's sister and bring her with them. He would build a new life somewhere far from the sugarcane fields and the whips and men like Marquis de Bassan. These plans were probably impossible. They both knew it. But speaking them aloud made the days bearable. In 1860, when Zacharie was 12 years old, the world outside the plantation began to change. News filtered down to the enslaved people through overheard fragments of conversation and news brought by enslaved people from other plantations. There were rumors. France and some nations were talking about abolishing slavery. Some said freedom would come soon. Some said enslaved people would be freed. Marquis de Bassin became nervous. He increased patrols around the plantation. He had the overseers whip anyone caught speaking of abolition. He said that if an enslaved person tried to escape, he would personally pursue them and make an example of them that others would never forget. The message was clear. Abolition or not, nothing would change on the de Bassins plantation. They were property. They would remain property, and anyone who thought otherwise would suffer. The event that finally broke Zacharie happened one cold night in December. Michel had been caught stealing food. It was a piece of bread, that was all. A single piece of bread from the kitchen. Michel hadn't eaten for 2 days. He had given his portion to a younger child who was sick. He was hungry. So, he took a piece of bread. The punishment for stealing was death. Marquis de Bassin made the announcement personally. He gathered all the enslaved people in front of the main house. He spoke in his calm, reasonable voice, the voice he used when he wanted everyone to understand that he was just. "Stealing is a crime," he said. "A crime against me, against this plantation, against the natural order that God himself established. This boy stole from me, and he will pay the price God demands." They hung Michel from a mango tree in front of everyone. Bertrand Boucher put the rope around his neck. 2 other overseers lifted him and let him drop. Michel didn't die quickly. The drop wasn't long enough to break his neck. He strangled slowly, his feet kicking, his hands clawing at the rope, his eyes bulging from their sockets. It took almost 5 minutes. Zacharie was forced to watch the entire time. When it was over, Marquis de Bassin ordered Michel's body to be left hanging for 3 days, a warning to anyone else who might think of stealing, a reminder of what happened to enslaved people who forgot their place. For 3 days, Zacharie walked past Michel's body on his way to and from the fields. He saw the birds come, he saw the flies, he saw what death looked like when left to rot in the open air. On the 3rd night, Zacharie made his decision. He waited for the moon to hide behind the clouds. He slipped out of the cabin while everyone slept. He found a knife in the blacksmith shop and cut Michel down from the mango tree. The body was stiff and beginning to smell. Zacharie didn't care. He carried his friend on his shoulder to a place behind the slave quarters where there was soft earth. He dug a grave with his bare hands. It took him 3 hours. When the hole was deep enough, he placed Michel in it and covered him with earth. He said no prayer. He no longer believed in God, a God who had allowed his mother to be whipped to death, a God who had allowed his sister to be sold like an animal, a God who had allowed his best friend to die for a piece of bread. That was not a God worthy of prayer, but he made another promise. He promised Michel that his death would mean something. He promised that he would escape. He would survive. He would return one day and make every person on that plantation answer for what they had done. Then Zacharie ran away. He had no plan. He had no provisions. He had nothing but the clothes on his back and the hatred in his heart. He crouched under the fence at the western edge of the plantation and began to move west, always west, away from the fields, away from the whips, away from everything he had ever known. He was 13 years old. He was alone in the mountains of Bourbon Island. He had never left the plantation in his entire life. He didn't know how to hunt. He didn't know how to find water. He didn't know where he was going or how to get there. He only knew he would rather die free than live one more day as an enslaved person. The first 3 days were the worst. Zacharie moved at night and hid during the day, knowing the overseers would be looking for him. He had no food. He found water in a stream and drank until his stomach ached. He ate berries that he hoped weren't poisonous. He continued to move towards the mountains, guiding himself by the stars in the way Michel had taught him during their whispered conversations about escape. On the 4th day, he heard the dogs. Marquis de Bassin had hired slave catchers, professional hunters who specialized in tracking runaway slaves. They had dogs trained to follow human scent for miles. They had horses and rifles and experience. They had caught dozens of fugitives over the years. They had never failed. Zacharie heard the dogs barking from the east. He knew what it meant. He knew he couldn't outrun the dogs. He knew that if they caught him, he would be taken back to the plantation. He would be whipped. He might be hanged like Michelle. At best, he would be branded as a runaway and sold further south to the brutal sugar plantations of Guadeloupe, where enslaved people were worked to death in a few years. He ran anyway. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. He fell into a dry stream bed and couldn't get up. The barking grew louder. It was getting closer. He could hear the horses now, the shouts of the men. He was going to be caught. Then he saw the hole. It was a gap in the stream bank, partially hidden by roots and dead leaves, a hole just big enough for a boy to squeeze into. Zacharie didn't hesitate. He pushed himself into the hole, wriggling through the narrow opening until he was completely hidden. He found himself in a small underground space barely big enough to sit up in. It was dark. It smelled of earth and decay. Something slithered over his foot, probably a snake or a rat. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. The dogs reached the stream bed a few minutes later. He could hear them sniffing, howling, confused. The stream water had washed away his scent. The hole was downwind. The dogs circled and barked, but couldn't find him. The slave catchers swore and kicked their animals. "He went into the water," one of them said. "He could be anywhere now. Spread out, check downstream." They rode off. Zacharie stayed in the hole for another 6 hours until well after the sounds had vanished. When he finally emerged, the sun was setting. He was alive. He was free. And he was more alone than he had ever been in his life. For the next 3 years, Zacharie survived in the mountains of Bourbon Island. This was not the civilized Bourbon of sugar plantations and colonial gentlemen. It was the frontier, vast expanses of dense forests and steep mountains where few white men had settled. Hostile territory, outlaw country, a place where an undocumented, unprotected black boy could completely disappear. He learned to survive the hard way, through trial and error, by almost dying and understanding what he had done wrong. He learned which plants were edible and which would kill you. He learned to find water by watching where animals went. He learned to catch small game with traps made of sticks and vines. He learned to make fire with flint and steel taken from an abandoned camp. He learned to read tracks, to sense when predators were near, to move through the landscape without leaving a trace. The mountains were brutal, but honest. They didn't hate him for being black. They didn't think he was property. It was simply survive or die, adapt or perish. There were no masters here, no overseers, no whips, just the earth and the sky and the struggle to see another sunrise. He met other people occasionally, outlaws hiding from the law, hunting parties, traders moving between islands. Some tried to hurt him, others tried to help. He learned to read people the way he read tracks, to know in seconds if someone meant him harm. He became hard, watchful, dangerous. The soft parts of him, the parts that had once known how to love and trust, retreated deep inside where nothing could touch them. By the age of 15, Zacharie had survived things that would have killed most adult men. He had been bitten by a coral snake and extracted the venom from his own leg with a stolen knife. He had almost frozen to death in a violent storm that dropped the temperature 50 degrees in an hour. He had fought a snow leopard with nothing but a sharpened stick. He had killed 2 men who had tried to rob him and sell him back into slavery. Yes, he had killed. The first time was the hardest. A white man in a ragged coat whom he had found sleeping in a cave and had decided that a lone black boy in the mountains was easy money. The man had a knife and a rope and a smile that said he had done this before. Zacharie only had a stone, but the man underestimated him. They always underestimated him. At the end of the fight, the man was dead, and Zacharie held the knife. He felt nothing, no guilt, no horror, just a cold satisfaction that another person who wanted to harm him could no longer harm anyone. The second killing was easier, the third even easier. Zacharie was becoming something. He didn't yet have words for it, but he could feel it growing within him. A capacity for violence that had been planted the day his mother died and nurtured by every cruelty he witnessed. In the spring of 1863, half dead from fever and hunger, Zacharie stumbled into the camp of a man who would change his life. The man was French, old, with gray hair. He sat by a small fire in a deep mountain gorge, roasting a rabbit on a stick. He had a rifle across his knees and 2 revolvers on his belt. His face was weathered and scarred. His eyes had the look of someone who had seen too much death and made peace with it. Zacharie collapsed at the edge of the fire. He was too weak to run, too weak to fight. If this man wanted to kill him, there was nothing he could do about it. But the old man didn't reach for his weapons. He simply watched the boy lying in the dirt, this skeleton wrapped in dark skin, this wild creature with burning eyes. After a long moment, the old man spoke. "You look like death, boy. Do you plan to die in my camp?" Zacharie found the strength to reply, "I don't plan to die anywhere. Not yet." The old man smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who recognized something familiar. "Good," he said. "Dying is easy. Living is the hard part." He tossed a piece of rabbit meat towards Zacharie. "Eat. You're too skinny to be worth killing. Maybe when you put on some weight, I'll change my mind." The old man's name was Jean-Baptiste Magon. Jean-Baptiste Magon wasn't supposed to exist anymore. According to authorities in several French Indian Ocean territories, he had been reported dead a decade ago. He had been reported killed on Bourbon in 1851, then again on Ile-de-France in 1854, then once more in Madagascar in 1857. Every report was convincing, each came with witnesses and details, and each was completely false. Jean-Baptiste Magon had simply mastered the art of disappearing. In his youth, Jean-Baptiste had been something of a legend. He had served in the French army, then with colonial authorities. After slave revolts threatened colonial control in the 1840s, Jean-Baptiste had participated in violent actions. He had watched enslaved people fight for their freedom. He had watched planters use violence to maintain control. He had watched a system that destroyed lives, that tore apart families, that treated human beings as property. But vengeance is exhausting. Violence weighs on the soul even when justified. In the end, Jean-Baptiste was tired. Tired of running, tired of killing, tired of waking up each morning wondering if this was the day someone would finally collect the bounty on his head. He faked his own death one last time and retreated into the mountains of Bourbon Island. He built a small cabin in a gorge so remote that even hunters never found it. He lived alone, he hunted, he grew vegetables in a small garden. He tried to forget everything he had been. Zacharie Noir collapsed at the edge of his fire, and Jean-Baptiste saw something that made forgetting impossible. "You have the eyes," Jean-Baptiste said one evening, about a week after Zacharie's arrival. The boy had recovered enough to sit up and eat solid food. He was still weak, but the fever was gone. He would survive. "What eyes?" Zacharie asked. "The eyes of a man who has already decided to kill. I saw those eyes before in my own mirror many years ago." Jean-Baptiste poked the fire with a stick. Sparks flew into the darkness. "Who do you want to kill, boy? And why?" Zacharie remained silent for a long time. He had never spoken of his past to anyone. He hadn't spoken much at all during his years in the mountains. But something about this old man made him want to speak. Perhaps it was the recognition in Jean-Baptiste's eyes. Perhaps it was simply the fact that for the first time in years, someone had shown him kindness without wanting anything in return. Whatever the reason, Zacharie opened his mouth and let the story pour out. He told Jean-Baptiste everything. His mother's death, his sister sold, Michel hanged from the tree, his escape, his years alone in the mountains, the names of the men he had sworn to kill: Bertrand Boucher, Laurent Marchand, Marquis Claude Desbassins, and others, the overseers who had whipped him, the slave hunters who had pursued him, every man who had treated him as property instead of a person. When Zacharie finished, Jean-Baptiste remained silent for a long time. The fire crackled between them. An owl called somewhere in the darkness. Finally, the old man spoke. "You want vengeance. I understand that. I've wanted vengeance for most of my life, but wanting isn't enough. Wanting will only get you killed." Jean-Baptiste looked at Zacharie with an expression that was almost sad. "You are angry, you are determined, but you are also untrained, incompetent. You wouldn't last 5 minutes against the men you want to kill. They have weapons, they have money, they have the law on their side. You only have hatred." "Then teach me," Zacharie said. "Teach me to be more than I am." Jean-Baptiste shook his head. "I came here to escape violence, to find peace, to die quietly in these mountains, and let my sins be forgotten. So why did you save me? Why didn't you let me die?" The question hung in the air. Jean-Baptiste stared at the fire for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "Because I saw myself in you," he said softly. Because I know what it's like to have everything taken, because I was once a boy with nothing but hatred and someone helped me when they didn't have to. I suppose I'm repaying a debt I've owed for 40 years. He sighed and stood up slowly, his joints cracking. I will teach you, but understand what you are asking for. Once you walk this path, there is no turning back. The things I will teach you will change you forever. You will become a killer, and killers do not have the luxury of peace. Not in this life, perhaps not in the next. Zacharie didn't hesitate. I stopped hoping for peace the day my mother died. All I want now is justice. Jean-Baptiste nodded slowly. Then, we begin tomorrow. The training lasted 4 years, 4 years of brutal and relentless education in the art of violence. Jean-Baptiste was not a gentle teacher. He didn't believe in gentleness. He believed that pain was the best instructor, that lessons learned through suffering were lessons never forgotten. He pushed Zacharie to the edge of his limits, then pushed him further. He broke the boy down and rebuilt him into something harder, something sharper, something deadly. The first year focused on the body. Zacharie learned to fight with his hands, with knives, with sticks, with anything that could be turned into a weapon. Jean-Baptiste taught him techniques from a dozen different traditions. Street fighting from Réunion's ports, knife handling, grappling holds, pressure points that could paralyze or kill with a single strike. Every day he trained until Zacharie could barely stand. Every night he tended his bruises and prepared for the next day's fight. The second year focused on firearms. Jean-Baptiste was a master with the rifle and revolver, and he passed that mastery on to his student. Zacharie learned to shoot at targets while standing still, then while moving, then while being shot at. He learned to draw and fire in a single, fluid motion, so fast the eye could barely follow. He learned to reload without looking, to clear jams by touch, to maintain his weapons in any condition. By the end of the second year, Zacharie could place 6 bullets through a playing card at 6 meters in less than 3 seconds. Jean-Baptiste said he was adequate. The third year focused on the mind. This was the training Zacharie didn't expect. Jean-Baptiste insisted that violence without intelligence was just noise. A true fighter had to understand his enemies, had to predict their movements, had to control his own emotions so completely that nothing could disturb his concentration. They played chess for hours. Jean-Baptiste taught Zacharie to think several moves ahead. They studied strategy and tactics, discussing battles and ambushes from history. They practiced meditation, sitting still for hours until Zacharie could calm the storm inside his head and find perfect stillness. But the most important lesson came in the third year, and it had nothing to do with fighting at all. It was about patience. Vengeance is not a fire, Jean-Baptiste said one evening as he sat, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls orange and red. Fire burns hot and fast and destroys itself. Vengeance is an ember. You keep it alive within you, small and controlled, feeding it just enough to keep it glowing. You wait, you watch, you prepare, and when the time is right, when everything is in place, then you blow on that ember and let it become an inferno. Not before, never before. Zacharie took that lesson to heart. He had burned with impatience for years, wanting to rush in first and start killing immediately. Jean-Baptiste taught him to convert that urgency into focus. Every day of training was one step closer to his goal. Every skill mastered was another weapon in his arsenal. Rushing would only get him killed. Patience would get him everything he wanted. The fourth year was about putting it all together. Jean-Baptiste set up elaborate scenarios in the mountains, testing Zacharie's ability to plan, infiltrate, and execute missions against imaginary enemies. He brought in former associates, ex-combatants, willing to play the role of guards and targets. Zacharie learned to scout a location before attacking, to identify escape routes, to anticipate complications, to improvise when plans fell apart. By the end of the fourth year, he was no longer a student. He was a weapon, sharpened and ready for use. On his 20th birthday, Jean-Baptiste called him to the fire for one last conversation. The old man looked older than ever. His hair had turned completely white during their years together. His hands trembled slightly now. He moved slower, more cautiously. Time was catching up with him. "Are you ready?" Jean-Baptiste said. "As ready as I can make you. What you do now is your choice. But I want you to understand something before you go." Zacharie waited. When I was young, I killed many men. Some deserved it, some probably didn't. I told myself I was fighting for justice, to avenge those who had been treated unfairly. And perhaps some of that was true. But here's what I learned in my old age. Jean-Baptiste paused, gathering his words. You trade. Every life you take carves something out of your soul. You don't notice it at first. You feel powerful, righteous, but with time, you realize parts of you are missing. The parts that could feel joy, the parts that could love you, the parts that could imagine a future beyond the next target. He looked at Zacharie with eyes that held decades of regret. I'm not telling you not to go. The men who wronged you deserve to die. I believe that. But I want you to know the cost. When you're finished, if you survive, you won't be the same person who started. You might not like who you become, and there's no going back. Zacharie thought for a moment. He thought of his mother's face, his sister's cries as she was taken away, Michelle's body swaying from the tree. He thought of every scar on his back, every hungry night, every moment of fear and pain and loss. They've already taken everything from me, he said at last. Whatever is left, I'm ready to spend it. No matter who I become, I'm ready to live with it. They made me this way. They can die by what they created. Jean-Baptiste nodded slowly. He reached a hand into his jacket and pulled out 2 revolvers. They were Colt .45 models, beautifully maintained with ivory grips that had yellowed with age. These were mine when I was young. They've killed more men than I can count. Now they are yours. He handed them to Zacharie with something ceremonial. Use them well, and when you are finished, if you find that you want to live, come back to these mountains. I will probably be dead by then, but the cabin will still be here. The garden will still be here. A place of rest if you ever want to stop running. Zacharie took the pistols. They felt perfect in his hands, balanced, deadly extensions of his will. Thank you, he said, for everything. Jean-Baptiste smiled his thin, sad smile. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you have survived. 3 days later, Zacharie Noir walked away from the mountains and returned to the world of men. He carried Jean-Baptiste's revolvers on his hips, a rifle on his back, and a list of names in his head. The first name on that list was Bertrand Boucher. It took Zacharie 2 months to find him. After the abolition of slavery and the self-dissolution of the plantation system, former overseers scattered across Bourbon Island and neighboring islands in search of new opportunities in a transformed world. Boucher had drifted to the coasts, eventually settling in a shabby little tavern in Saint-Gilles-de-Bourbon, about 100 kilometers from where the Des Bassins plantation once stood. He worked as a tavern keeper now, spending his wages on alcohol and telling anyone who would listen about the good old days when he kept enslaved people in line. Zacharie watched him for a week before making his move. He observed Boucher's routines, when he woke, where he ate, which tavern he frequented, who his friends were, if he carried a weapon. The answer to the last question was yes. An old pistol Boucher kept at his waist, more out of habit than skill. Zacharie noted that his draw was slow. His reflexes were dulled by years of alcohol. He was no threat. On the 7th day, Zacharie entered the tavern at noon. The room was filled with laborers and vagrants, seeking shade from Bourbon's brutal sun. Boucher sat at a table in the back, playing cards with 3 other men. He was heavier than Zacharie remembered. His face was red and bloated from alcohol, but his hands were the same. The hands that had held the whip, the hands that had killed his mother. The room grew silent as Zacharie approached. A black man entering a white tavern was unusual enough. A black man dressed entirely in black with 2 gleaming pistols on his hips, moving with the confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. That was something else entirely. Zacharie stopped at Boucher's table. The card players looked up nervously. Boucher squinted at the stranger, too drunk to sense the danger. Bertrand Boucher, Zacharie said. It wasn't a question. Who wants to know? Boucher mumbled. You worked as an overseer at the Des Bassins plantation before abolition. Something flickered in Boucher's eyes. A memory. A ghost. He straightened slightly, trying to focus. So what? That was a long time ago. Not long enough. Zacharie's voice was calm, almost soft. August 18th, 1858. You whipped a woman named Josephine 37 times. She died that night from her injuries. Boucher's face went pale. His hand began to move towards his pistol, but before his fingers touched the grip, he was staring down the barrel of Zacharie's Colt. The draw was too fast to see. One moment, Zacharie's hands were empty. The next, death was pointing at Boucher's face. "I wouldn't," Zacharie said softly. The other card players scrambled from the table, knocking over chairs in their haste to get away. The rest of the tavern had become completely silent. Everyone was watching now. "Who are you?" Boucher whispered. Zacharie leaned forward. "Josephine was my mother. My name is Zacharie. It means God remembers." He watched recognition dawn in Boucher's eyes. Terror followed close behind. "I told you once I would find you. You thought I had forgotten. Do you believe God has forgotten?" Boucher began to beg. His words tumbled out in a desperate stream. He was sorry. He was just following orders. He was different now. He had changed. "Please, please." Zacharie listened until the words ran dry. Then he slowly shook his head. "My mother begged too, and you didn't stop. Why should I?" The gunshot echoed through the silent room. Boucher collapsed onto the table, a hole in the center of his forehead. The card players were splattered with blood. Someone screamed. Zacharie holstered his weapon calmly, turned, and walked out the front door into the blinding sunlight. By the time anyone thought to follow him, he was gone. News spread across Bourbon Island like wildfire. A black man had walked into a white tavern in broad daylight and killed a white man. Not in self-defense, not in a fair fight, an execution, cold-blooded and deliberate. The victim was a former plantation overseer. The assassin was a former slave, and he had escaped without a trace. Within a week, wanted posters appeared in every town. 500 francs for information leading to the capture of the man they called the Black Ghost. But no one had gotten a good enough look at him. No one knew his name. He was just a tall, dark shadow who killed and disappeared. Zacharie didn't care about the posters. He was already moving towards the next name on his list. Laurent Marchand, the slave trader who had bought his sister Marguerite, was harder to find. The slave trade had ended with abolition, and many slave traders had changed businesses. Marchand had reinvented himself as a legitimate businessman in Martinique, dealing in sugar and colonial goods. He lived in a beautiful house on a respectable street, attended church every Sunday, and was considered a prominent member of the community. No one wanted to talk about how he had made his initial fortune. No one wanted to remember. Zacharie spent 3 weeks gathering intelligence. He learned Marchand's schedule, his habits, his security. The man was more cautious than Boucher had been. He kept armed guards at his house. He traveled with protection. He was afraid, though perhaps not specifically, of Zacharie. Men who built their wealth on human suffering tend to have many enemies. The solution came to Zacharie one evening as he watched Marchand's house from across the street. Every Tuesday evening, Marchand visited a private club on the edge of town, a place where rich men drank rum and discussed business away from prying eyes. Marchand always went there alone. His guards waited outside. That was his vulnerability. On a Tuesday in October 1873, Zacharie entered the club through a back window while the staff was distracted by evening service. He moved through the shadows like the ghost people called him, avoiding the few servants and club employees. He found Marchand in a private room, sitting alone with a glass of rum, waiting for his associates to arrive. Marchand looked up when the door opened. His eyes widened when he saw the tall black man in dark clothing. He wasn't stupid. He had heard about the killing in Saint-Gilles. He knew immediately why this stranger was here. "It's you," Marchand said, breathless. "The one they're looking for." Zacharie closed the door behind him. "Laurent Marchand, in 59. You went to the Desbassins plantation and bought a 6-year-old girl named Marguerite. You paid 400 francs for her." Marchand's hand moved towards the bell on the table, the one that would summon his guards. Zacharie drew in a single movement. The bullet shattered Marchand's wrist. The man screamed, clutching his bleeding hand. "That was a warning," Zacharie said. "The next won't be. Where is she?" Marchand was crying now. Tears and snot ran down his face. "Who? I don't know what you're talking about. I've bought and sold hundreds of enslaved people. You expect me to remember just one?" "Her name was Marguerite. She was my sister. You took her from the Desbassins plantation. Where did she go?" Marchand shook his head desperately. "I don't know. I don't keep records of individual sales. She could have been sold anywhere. Guadeloupe, Martinique, Haiti. I don't remember." Zacharie studied the man's face. He was telling the truth. He really didn't remember. Marguerite was nothing to him but merchandise, just 400 francs changing hands. He had probably forgotten her before his carriage even left the plantation. Something inside Zacharie turned very cold. He had hoped, despite everything, that Marchand might have some information, a clue that would help him find his sister. Instead, he had found only emptiness. Marguerite was gone, lost in the vast machinery of slavery. He would probably never know what had happened to her. Zacharie represents something the system feared above all else, the idea that the enslaved might remember, that they might return, that there might be a price to pay for centuries of cruelty. This fear haunted the French colonists throughout the era of slavery and beyond. It drove them to create even more oppressive laws and even more brutal systems of control. They knew deep down that what they were doing was wrong, and they knew that evil would sooner or later demand a reckoning. Zacharie's story is fictional, but the world he inhabited was real. The violence he suffered was real. The systems he fought against were real. The children who were stolen, the families who were destroyed, the lives that were crushed under the weight of slavery, all of it was real. And the descendants of those children, those families, those crushed lives, are still here, still bearing the weight of that history, still waiting for a reckoning that never came. When Zacharie's mother gave him his name, she chose a name that meant God remembers. She believed that one day, somehow, justice would come, that her people's suffering would not be forgotten, that the crimes committed against them would not remain unpunished forever. She did not live to see that justice. Neither did Zacharie. Not truly. The men he killed were a tiny fraction of those responsible for slavery. The system itself continued in new forms for generations after his story ended. But the name remains, Zacharie. God remembers. And now you remember too. You know this story. You know what was done. You know the names of the guilty and the faces of the innocent. You know that slavery did not simply disappear in 1848. It evolved, it adapted, it found new ways to extract black labor and destroy black families, and part of that evolution continues to this day. The question Zacharie's story asks is not whether vengeance is justified. That is a question each person must answer for themselves. The question is simpler and more difficult. Will we remember? Will we face the truth of what was done? Will we acknowledge the debts that were never paid and the wounds that were never healed? Will we build a future that honors the suffering of the past? Zacharie found his own answer in the mountains of Bourbon Island. He chose vengeance, then chose mercy, then chose silence. He disappeared into history, leaving only a legend behind. But legends have power. They remind us of what is possible. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, there are those who refuse to submit, those who fight, those who remember. His mother's voice still echoes through the years. God remembers every wound, every tear, every wrong done to his children, and one day he will make it right. Zacharie's story is finished, but the story of Bourbon Island, the story of slavery and its consequences, the story of injustice and the long struggle for justice, that story continues. It continues in every black family that carries the trauma of ancestors they never knew. It continues in every community that continues to fight for equality. It continues in every classroom where this history is taught and every living room where it is discussed. It continues in you now that you know. This remembrance is all the dead ever asked for. Remember what was done. Remember who did it. Remember who suffered and build a world where it does not happen again.